Welcome, everyone. We're just letting folks come in from the waiting room. We'll give folks a couple of minutes to get into the room here. All right. Well, we have a packed agenda today, so I'm going to get us started. Welcome. My name is Dr. Sarah Kopelovich. I am a founding and core faculty member of the University Center for Mental Health Policy and the Law, and I have the distinct honor of moderating our webinar today on lived experiences with civil commitment. I happen to have known each of our distinguished presenters, Carolynn Ponzoha, Schilde, and Laura Van Tosh, for many years, and have even had the fortune of collaborating with two of them. I speak for the entire center when I say that we are incredibly fortunate to have them here representing their experiences with civil commitment in the coming hour. I'll be introducing each of them in turn, but first I just wanted to note that I attended Laura Van Tosh's Mental Health Policy Roundtable just yesterday on the topic of lived experience in mental health research, which featured an incredible lineup of experts. One of those experts, Dr. Nev Jones, noted the importance of foregrounding the diversity of experience when we use the term lived experience. There is no single lived experience. There is a huge range of experiences related to how psychiatric disorders and psychiatric treatment impact people's lives. Today, we are privileged to be joined by three lived experience experts from our state, and it is my pleasure to introduce each of them to you. But first, we have a few announcements that I'll be walking everyone through. This webinar series is brought to you by the University of Washington Center for Mental Health Policy and the Law, which is housed within the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Our mission is to address the most urgent issues arising at the interface of mental health and the law in order to help justice-involved people with mental illness lead full and productive lives. This talk marks the halfway point of our civil commitment series. If you haven't registered for upcoming talks, you can do so through the link that's on the screen and will be entered into the chat. As you can see, we have an array of experts, including clinicians, legal experts, educators, policymakers, as well as individuals with lived experience. And I have the daunting task of following our speakers today in our next talk on March 4th. Oops, sorry about that. The recording and the presentation slides will be made available on our website within a week of today's presentation, and we'll be emailing the link. Continuing education is only available for attendees who attend the live Zoom session. Certificates of attendance will be available for attendees who indicated interest. And the continuing education units for UW employees will be emailed from the cmhpl@uw.edu email account. And for non-UW learners, we will be tracking attendance via Zoom. So you don't need to do anything. We've already got your information through your unique Zoom link. Today's speakers, the planners of this series, and I as a moderator have no relevant financial relationships to disclose. You each have on the bottom of your screen a Q&A icon. If you click on that, you can enter questions for our presenters. We will do our best to log these questions as they come in and save them for the time that we have reserved at the end of the three talks. If we don't get to all of them, which I can assure you we won't, because we've had a lot of experience with fabulous on-topic questions so far, we do log all of the questions and have banked them so that we can present those to all of our panelists at our Q&A session on June 10th. So we hope that you'll join us for that session. And then finally, just to note that the opinions expressed in this webinar are the views of the speaker, do not reflect an official position of the CMHPL or the University of Washington. No official support or endorsement of the opinions described here is intended or should be inferred. If you would like automated closed captions, you can click on the closed caption icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we will have an evaluation poll at the end of this session. We value this feedback, and we also pass this feedback along to the presenters. So we appreciate if you could take a couple minutes at the end of the hour to complete that. All right, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Carolynn Ponzoha. Carolynn is a mental health advocate living with schizoaffective disorder, borderline personality disorder, and complex PTSD. She spreads awareness of psychosis through online videos and discussions. Apart from her work spreading psychosis awareness, she is in recovery from addiction with 5 years sober and attributes a large part of her mental wellness to sobriety. Carolynn, with that, I will turn things over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, I'm Carolynn, and before we get started, I would just like to go over today's learning objectives. The first is to describe experiences of being an involuntary patient or family member in an Involuntary Treatment Act ITA process. The second is to consider how negative aspects of ITA could be modified and improved. And the third is to identify alternative interventions to prevent crises. So as I said, my name is Carolynn Ponzoha, and I'm a mental health advocate. I primarily focus on spreading education and awareness about psychosis through informational videos on TikTok and YouTube under the handle Psychotic in Seattle. I live with multiple mental and chronic illnesses. As Sarah said, I have schizoaffective disorder, borderline personality disorder, and complex PTSD, but I also have narcolepsy and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And I mostly talk about my experiences with schizoaffective disorder because psychosis has so greatly affected my life. I have experience both with being voluntarily and involuntarily hospitalized multiple times. And I'm here to talk with you today about my experience with civil commitment, how I think it can be improved, and what alternatives I would suggest. So before psychosis, I was a college student at a small school in Wyoming. It was called Central Wyoming College. It's in Riverton, Wyoming. And I was an outdoor education and leadership major. I studied wilderness medicine in the hopes of becoming a wilderness therapy guide. At the time that I was in school, I was heavily bullied and very depressed. I was also going into the prodromal phase of a psychotic episode, and I attributed my negative symptoms to the bullying and depression I was already experiencing. I had the symptom of avolition, which caused me to lose motivation and drive to perform in school and take care of myself. I also had the symptom of anhedonia, which caused me to lose my interest and pleasure in the rock climbing and backpacking and hiking that brought me to school. I felt that I was wasting my time in school, so I dropped out. I moved to Washington State, and I subsequently went into a psychotic episode. My episode came on gradually and went relatively unnoticed by everyone around me. I feel that this was in part because I had the symptom of anosognosia, which caused me to lose insight into my mental state. So I didn't know that anything had changed in me, and I fully believed in my hallucinations and delusions. The psychosis progressed over the course of a year and became quite dangerous for me. I began wandering away from home for miles and miles. I would often be inadequately dressed, or I wouldn't be wearing clothes at all, and I would be picked up by the police over and over again. It was clear that I was in a mental health crisis and that I needed help. However, there were barriers to getting the care that I needed. For one thing, there was a lack of education about psychosis in my family, so no one knew what I was going through. And because they didn't understand what was happening to me, it continued to get worse and worse. I was also very socially isolated. Upon moving to Washington, the only people that I knew were my parents, and I also lived by myself on my own, so people weren't around to see the progression. There was also a limited availability of beds in the psych units in my area. So when it did get to the point that I was in and out of the ER, I would be told each time that there was nowhere for me to go. Eventually, I was hospitalized. When I was hospitalized involuntarily, and I remember it being a very confusing experience. There was little effort by the staff to help me understand what was going on. So I was always afraid of everything, and I needed a lot of help just feeling okay, understanding anything at all. I believe there was a disconnect between the staff and me in which I didn't understand them and they didn't understand me. I feel that a lot of them had very little patience for me and what I was going through. A lot of them were really rough with me as opposed to how they treated the other patients. They treated me as though they didn't think I could tell how I was being treated or that I was being treated harshly. But I can always tell how I'm being treated, even in psychosis. I can tell when I'm being disrespected or treated less than. I'm still the same person in psychosis that I am with you today, but in hospitalizations outside of psychosis, I was treated completely differently. I was treated like an actual person, which was a dignity I wasn't granted in psychosis. I think one great example of this is the time that I believed I had children that had been kidnapped, and I was very distressed. I was screaming, "Where are my babies? Where are my babies?" And instead of helping me, the staff told me to be quiet for the sake of the other patients because I was scaring them. I believe that if I actually had been a mother who'd lost her children, I would have been treated with more empathy. But because it was only real to me and it wasn't real to them, I was treated like the source of everyone else's fear and not the person primarily experiencing fear who needed help. Sometimes I would be screaming in fear and they'd put me in seclusion rather than de-escalate the situation, which was ineffective because it didn't resolve the fear and I didn't get the help that I needed. Aside from the staff who would mistreat me, there were patients who were bullying me and they would take great pleasure in giving me delusions. They would tell me that another patient was my boyfriend and laugh when I would treat him like my boyfriend. They would tell me that I was on a reality TV show and laugh at my paranoia. When I believed that being touched would curse me, they went out of their way to touch me as much as possible. The staff caught on to how I was being treated, and they discharged me early to protect me from the bullying of the other patients. So in my hospitalization, I never got any better. I left the hospital just as severely mentally ill as I came in. I ultimately recovered from my psychosis outside of the hospital. Fortunately, I had a lot of help in recovering from my psychosis. After being discharged, my twin sister moved in with me and became my caregiver. She helped me with the things that had left me unsafe. For instance, she kept me from wandering away from home, and she would help me through my paranoia and fear. I also got a prescriber outside of the hospital who did a great job of managing my medication and putting me on a regimen that brought me out of psychosis. It did take several months, but I was able to recover from my episode. I was also very involved in my community at the time. My sister would take me to a recovery center in town where people would hang out, and it was a safe place to be around safe people. It was a place where I didn't have to worry about wandering off or being a harm to myself. I was able to get back up on my feet through these supports and become independent. After recovering, I was able to gain employment as an in-home caregiver. I would go to my clients' homes to assist them with daily tasks. Aside from the physical tasks of dressing, toileting, and assisting with ambulation, as well as offering companionship, I did basic everyday things like cooking, laundry, light housekeeping, and, being company to them. So I think that a lot of those in-home skills could be applied to caregiving for a person in psychosis. Companionship was the most valuable tool I needed from people around me, and additional help in the form of transporting clients to appointments, assisting with errands, or giving reminders to take care of hygiene can make a big difference for people in similar positions. Caregivers could also help keep clients safe from getting into danger, as my sister did for me. I think that caregivers for people with psychosis would be a positive way to help, and I think that certified peer counselors could be an excellent candidate for caregiving. There have also been many recovery centers in my community, including the Recovery Cafe and a clubhouse, which will be opening soon. They are operated by trained recovery coaches and certified peer counselors. These centers offer different services such as connecting people with DSHS to get benefits, help in finding housing, referrals to DVSAS, the domestic violence and sexual assault services, and food, clothing, showers, and laundry for the unhoused community. In the past, I even took a class to make a RAP plan, which allowed me to implement recovery tools in my daily life and set up measures for care in the event of future mental health emergencies. All of these resources mitigate barriers in overcoming mental health crises. Whether a person is actively going through a mental health crisis or recovering from one, these services are valuable in gaining stability and having a safe place to be. So here's my takeaway about my experience with civil commitment. First of all, was it necessary? The only thing that really came out of my hospitalization was getting medicated, which I feel could have happened outside of the hospital if I had a good prescriber. Because I came out of the hospital without any improvement, it made no difference where I was psychotic, whether it was in the hospital or outside in the community. What good came out of it? Like I said, I was medicated, and I feel that was really the only benefit of that experience. I was also diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, which helped me in the future to navigate other psychotic episodes and to get the treatment that I needed through different providers. What could have been better? I feel that the treatment of people with psychosis in a hospital setting could be a lot better. I think it's unfair that people with psychosis could be treated any differently than any other patients. I think de-escalation would be preferable to forced treatment. I was in seclusion, and I don't think it did me any good. I don't think anything positive came out of it that couldn't have been resolved with a one-on-one conversation with a nurse. Could the hospitalization have been prevented? I absolutely think it could have. As I said, my psychosis progressed over the course of a year, and for much of that time, I was safe. I wasn't a harm to myself. I wasn't in danger. And I think if I had been seen by a doctor early on when my symptoms were just starting, it wouldn't have needed to go to the extreme of being hospitalized. How can it be avoided? I feel that psychosis education goes a long way in preventing these extremes. I think if there was more of an understanding of psychosis, people could be able to get treatment before it becomes an emergency. I think there can be interventions like first episode psychosis programs before it gets to that point. And what are some alternatives I believe could be preferable to hospitalization? I feel that community involvement is a huge way of helping a person to recover. For me, it came in the form of recovery centers, but there are also peer respites that are peer run, which are places where you go overnight voluntarily to be safe and recover from a mental health crisis. Having caregivers in my case was a really huge way of recovering without the need for a hospitalization. I have had multiple caregivers help me through psychosis multiple times. So those are my thoughts of my experience with civil commitment, how I think it can be improved, and alternative interventions I would suggest to prevent crises. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolynn. We're going to save questions until the end for all three presenters. So I now have the pleasure of introducing Karen Schilde. Karen serves on the boards for the National Alliance for Mental Illness, Snow Isle, and Everett Clubhouse under Hero House Northwest, facilitates NAMI family support groups, and trains state teachers for NAMI's Family to Family program. She volunteers with the UW Spirit Center as a Psychosis Reach Family Ambassador and a Family Bridger.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm describing my family's experiences having a relative with a mental health condition in the ITA process. ITA was our family's only choice. It's never the optimal choice. And it is painful for me to recount aspects from my son's 16 involuntary hospitalizations and multiple suicide attempts. We see the behavioral and emotional changes, but then we find ourselves trapped in a complex system which criminalizes this behavior to reach that threshold to get help, or that puts up barriers to safety and care. And the same system threatens to rupture the relationship between loved ones and families. It is the loved one who is suffering, being traumatized by this experience, losing their dignity and feeling more isolated, perhaps even losing that crucial lifeline of family. We families feel helpless as we witness our loved one going through a system designed to help them. Not knowing that if my son would die, I had to watch 8 police officers hold him down in my home. When he attempted to jump from a 5th-story building, a DCR said, he has a better chance of getting help if he'd run around naked on the streets and not just try to jump off a building. In a later incident, when he did strip naked in a downtown intersection claiming to be Jesus, the defense attorney dismissed his life-threatening action by asking me, Friday was a very hot day in Seattle, was it not? I had to see him wheeled into a courtroom, strapped to a gurney, so sedated he was unable to speak. Nevertheless, an attorney asked him 6 times, would you like to go to the psychiatric hospital? So this comment reflects the illusion of choice for our loved ones, that they could make a decision at a time when their judgment and insight are so impaired, and for families who are unable to choose hospitalization before our loved ones get to this stage. So in many of those waiting rooms, I sat and thought to myself, no one should ever have to do this alone. So how could courts and hospitals improve? Adopt the family court advocate model with Zoom options for smaller courts. Provide families with general information, such as NAMI navigating a mental health crisis roadmap to Puget Sound and on the justice system. Supply waiting rooms with brochures about next steps of support groups and classes. Train volunteer court escorts modeled on those sometimes provided to victims of domestic abuse in courtrooms. Communicate in advance with families about where and when detention or continuance hearings will be and how they can participate. Hospitals must discharge patients with at least a 2-week supply of meds rather than script on a loose piece of paper. Hospitals must communicate clearly about release details, especially where there are protection orders. A relative living 2,000 miles away received a hospital voicemail message that my son was on his way to her, even though he had been discharged from a hospital just 5 miles from my home here. Add separate, quiet entrances to the ER for mental health crises versus the chaotic ER. Expand the existing UW Family Bridger program, now in a pilot testing stage, to provide trained peer support to those families with a loved one hospitalized for psychosis. How is ITA being applied within our state? So my family's experiences are not out of the norm. According to a 2022 Washington Law Review study on King County ITA, a majority are returnees. In fact, 3/4 of people with 3 prior ITAs are recommitted in King County within 3 years. Black residents and homeless are disproportionately involved. 7% of King County residents are Black, but Black residents represent 15% of ITA. Similarly, only 1% of King County residents were unhoused, but of those returnees with 3 prior ITAs, 41% had housing instability. An inpatient facility is highly likely to deny them a bed for the very same reasons they are eligible for one. According to this Seattle Times article, 25% of the time, King County facilities deny someone experiencing a behavioral health crisis a bed based on complex medical needs, including acuity, grave disabilities, or even hygiene, exactly the symptoms of the illness. And this is separate from Washington's poor statistics on general availability of beds, where we rank so low. For example, Snohomish County should have 430 long-term residential psych beds, whereas we have 6. This shortage has been a contributing factor in delays for my son, with days of wait in the ER. Premature hospital discharges contribute to increased needs without any continuity of care. 3 times my son had to be readmitted, twice after 2 days and once after only hours, when he was unable to walk or talk. Isn't this a civil rights issue? Do patients with mental illness have equal rights to appropriate treatment under the ADA or Washington State Constitution? How does their treatment compare to that for the elderly with dementia? Is this hypocritical to maintain respect for individual rights, yet erect barriers to care? Street, ITA, hospital, street, jail. Seattle Times and KUOW produced a 6-part podcast on this churn or rotating door among street persons with psychosis called Lost Patients. Some have compared our system to only providing medical treatment once someone has stage 4 cancer. How could we divert those resources to earlier diagnosis and intervention at the beginning instead? So what are alternatives to the ITA? Our current law creates conditions that require harm instead of preventing harm. We use the pretense of civil rights, demanding an appearance of free will, as in my example of the attorney asking my son 6 times if he'd like to go to the hospital. In our November Hot Topics session, Shadow Jones talked about the imminence factor, where the son with a knife is disarmed by cops and is therefore no longer in imminent danger. Imminence forces families to wait until a loved one's symptoms are so severe that they are causing harm, most often to themselves or to us. We are one of only 7 states with language about property damage. That assigns a monetary value and focuses on a level of criminal activity versus the illness and symptoms that indicate a risk for ongoing deterioration and harm. I was once asked to document all the repair and replacement costs to determine if the dollar damage from my son was minor or substantial, without considering instead how desperately ill he was. An alternative to using DCRs as gatekeepers to access care would be to adopt other states' model of allowing professionals to recommend hospitalization for their own patients. And that may not protect against all the threats to individual autonomy, but it exponentially increases the likelihood that the person suffering can get hospital treatment rather than getting their behaviors criminalized. And this would ease the bottleneck pressure on the justice system, which inadvertently delays timely care due to lack of staff. So what are other means of avoiding ITA? Expand mobile crisis outreach units in all areas like Eugene, Oregon's Cahoots. And kudos to Seattle's new care unit. I wish the scientific connections between high-potency cannabis and psychosis spectrum disorders in adolescents had been available earlier. The UW's Addictions, Drug, and Alcohol Institute sponsored this first national symposium on the cannabis psychosis link in September 2024. Danish research found a portion of schizophrenia diagnoses might have been avoided without early, frequent, and high-potency use of cannabis in adolescents. I wish first episode psychosis interventions, coordinated specialty care, multidisciplinary teams such as Washington's New Journeys could have been there for my son and our family. Families can be allies as they are for most all other healthcare situations. Open dialogue interventions offer a team response within 24 hours in the home, offering therapy around the kitchen table, giving autonomy and agency to the loved one. In places like Finland, it has been one of the reasons they have reduced their previously high suicide rate by 1/2 in the past 35 years. Widespread in the UK, CBTP, or cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis, is recognized in the US as a standard of care. However, we have few trained providers. The UW Spirit Lab offers training in CBTP techniques that families can use with their loved ones through Psychosis Reach. Retired NIMH head Thomas Insel, in his book Healing, cited two reasons to be optimistic about recovery: peer counselors and clubhouses. Fountain House in New York City has been followed by 400 Clubhouse Internationals in 33 countries and 4 accredited clubhouses in Washington state. Crisis stabilization centers offer yet another place to heal. Peer respite centers offer a voluntary home-like environment with peer counselors staffing the facility. So besides changes to our law and DCR system, more of these preventative, early, and evidence-based practices could be instituted at the first signs of distress to prevent ITA as the only choice. ITA is not the best choice, but sometimes now it is unfortunately the only choice. It has been terrifying for my son and for me and continues to be, but it shouldn't have to be.
Thank you so much, Karen. We're going to turn now to Laura Van Tosh. If you're not already familiar, Laura Van Tosh's work is born from her experience as a patient turned activist, and she has been involved with the peer movement since 1985. She is the founder of the Mental Health Policy Roundtable, which I referenced at the start of this talk, which brings newcomers and veterans of policy together in a neutral environment of learning. Laura has written extensively about peer-operated behavioral health care services and homelessness, and has worked inside 3 state psychiatric hospitals. She is a member of the Behavioral Health Joint Legislative and Executive Committee, which is developing a 5-year strategic plan for the behavioral health care system in Washington state, and serves as a consultant with the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute. And with that, we'll pause our screen sharing and turn things over to Laura.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to the Center for Mental Health Policy and the Law for the invitation to provide my perspective on these issues. I first want to say how challenging it is to talk about involuntary treatment as well as the ITA itself as a process in the medical arena, which obviously includes psychiatric disabilities. Why I say that is that all of my admissions, I should say, to mental health facilities in my life have been through the Involuntary Treatment Act in a couple of different states, but basically the same process overall. And it's just terribly ironic that that was the way that I entered the system in every instance that I was institutionalized, which totals about 7 hospitalizations at this point in my life. And I just want to point out that I think we can do better overall. My overall comment for today basically is to say that we should not be using involuntary tools when there are effective interventions missing in our system that would be acceptable by voluntary patients if they were available and offered. And I mention this as a call to action that we have plenty of work to do in our field to develop those services and supports based on the evidence and offered to patients above and beyond the involuntary tools that we seem to be relying on today as a field and in the system at large. I'm going to be talking about a couple of episodes that I had. One when I was homeless around 2011, 12, and 13 into 2015 for a few years there. I was homeless and then eventually hospitalized for 30 days, actually. And the other hospitalization occurred here in Washington, where I required emergency psychiatric services and was admitted after the installment of 988. And so I was involved in a mental health emergency during that point. When I was homeless, as I said, in 2011 and forward into 2015, I was actively psychosis and also homeless. However, this also occurred in Salem, Oregon. I walked into the emergency room at Salem Health, where I was homeless on the street 15 times, and I was refused voluntary care or admission each and every one of those times. My hospital bills, which were dealt with later, had these 15 hospitalizations outlined, and each time that I went to the ER, I mostly wanted to find a safe place to sleep, and that's why I went to the ER, and I also asked for help, and unfortunately was not admitted. Eventually, I was found on the floor of an emergency psychiatric facility located on the grounds of the hospital, and I was handcuffed and brought to the ER from one end of a parking lot to the other. And then I felt profound fear and was involuntarily medicated in a seclusion room. That was how I entered that particular hospitalization. I'd like to suggest that in North Carolina, actually, there's a bill that I think is being debated, or some regulations to end police from transporting clients from emergency rooms to inpatient units. And I'd like to suggest that we develop a way to provide better, less intrusive transportation to emergency services where we're not being led by handcuffs into healthcare facilities. That added a great deal of fear to that particular hospitalization, and it resulted in a violent entry to receiving services through forcible medication in a seclusion room. The second hospitalization that I just want to mention, I was having medication side effects from one of the newer medications for bipolar disorder. And even, almost according to the commercials on TV, I actually had a psychotic episode while I was on a new medication. And it was sort of a slow descent into a psychosis when I was living independently. And unfortunately, all of the strands became loose, and I ended up becoming involuntarily committed to a short-term psychiatric unit. I was waiting for a bed in the ER during this hospitalization, and I had ongoing unusual behavior that went over the heads of the staff of the emergency room. And I actually flushed my house keys. I had my purse with me. They let me keep my purse. And I ended up flushing my house keys down the toilet in the emergency room. And the staff didn't even notice that I had been doing behaviors like that. Eventually, I was, as I mentioned, brought to a short-term psychiatric unit where I stayed for about 14 days. And my emergency contact, who is actually my therapist, navigated the discharge planning process with social work department at the hospital. And I was able to be discharged and brought back to, comfortably brought back to my apartment, where I was able to regain footing and continue on the road to recovery. That particular contact with my therapist and social work made the discharge process much more efficient and doable. And I was able, as I said, to continue maintaining my health in the community. I also want to just mention that the crisis care centers levy, which was passed, and I believe Karen mentioned it, we're developing 5 crisis care centers in King County. And the process is unfolding through an implementation plan that was approved by County Council. I do want to just mention, in terms of the development of these centers, that I wish, I don't know if it's going to be possible, that there be flexibility with the implementation plan of these centers so that we can allow for patient experiences to help drive the full implementation of these centers. In other words, we may discover as we're unveiling these centers that there may be processes that need to be adjusted and where the implementation plan will need to be flexible in order to make those adjustments. I'm concerned that patient experiences will not be as well relied on and actually should be relied on as these centers are unfolding before us in King County. My final thought that I just want to leave with you is that if we're to believe that forced treatment is an answer, and included in that is involuntary commitment, to what end do we consider it a good solution or a good outcome for mental illness? What I mean is that every hospitalization that I began with was an involuntary commitment proceeding. How are we considering that a success? Do we consider involuntary commitments a success when people might be hospitalized for days or weeks, brought back out to the community and returning for another involuntary commitment? How are we making that a success within our field? What else can we do to provide successful alternatives so that people can access treatment and be discharged safely and return to our community? Again, we should not be using involuntary tools when there are effective interventions missing in our system that would be accepted voluntarily by patients if they were available and offered. We have much work to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I say right back at you. I'm going to ask for Selena just to bring our learning objective slide back onto the screen. These learning objectives were where we started. This is where we'll end the talks, anchoring this hour in the experiences that were represented on involuntary commitment, considering how negative aspects of the Involuntary Treatment Act could be modified and improved. And there were a lot of ideas and initiatives and programs that are already in development or operational that were shared today, and identifying alternative interventions to prevent crises. I am going to invite all of the members of our panel today to bring themselves back onto video so that I can take us through some of the questions that came in during the talk. And I'm going to start with a question that I think I'd like to pitch to all three of you, recognizing that we have until about 12:55, 12:56 before we'll need to end the Q&A. And this came in from an ER social worker who said that she's often the person having discussions with patients about hospitalization. It can be hard to balance the need for care while also being honest about the traumas of hospitalization. Do you have any advice on how to best have these conversations, or are there things that you wish providers told you about hospitalizations prior to going? Carolynn, do you want to kick us off?
Yes. I don't remember my hospitalization clearly just because of the nature of my mental state at the time, but I do remember that there was like a court process and I had to go before a judge a few times, like 2, I think, times. And I honestly, to this day, have no idea like what that was about, like what like was said, like, you know, I'm sure it was probably related to like how long I would stay, but I really wish someone had walked me through that. I wish I'd had someone, you know, representing me, because I feel like asking someone in my mental state to go in front of a judge and speak for themselves without any understanding is kind of like asking a little kid to go in front of a judge. Because I had about as much understanding as like okay, well, I guess I'm going to be talking to, like someone in a legal setting, but I don't know what's going on. I don't know what they're asking of me. I don't know what I'm supposed to say, and no one's explaining this to me. I to this day don't know what that, like, I genuinely don't know what that was about. And I wish someone had walked me through it, told me what was happening instead of just, okay, go in there and answer questions. That was really, really confusing to me.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Carolyn. Laura, do you want to respond?
Can you briefly restate the question?
Yeah, the question was how to best have conversations around the need for care while also being honest about some of the hazards of hospitalization. And are there things that you wish providers had told you prior to your involuntary commitment?
Right. Well, I really think that needs to happen when you're being admitted. And I wish too, I didn't get a chance to mention that. I forgot to mention this, but the role of peer specialists is very important. And I know what actually helped me in the short-term psychiatric admission or hospitalization that I had for 2 weeks. A peer specialist actually appeared well over a week after I was admitted. I wished it was at the beginning, but she came, when she did. And it was completely wonderful and important that she was able to visit with me. She helped to explain a little bit about what to continue expecting over the next additional week. She connected me to a cell phone because I'd also thrown out, aside from my house keys, I got rid of my cell phone, which was unfortunate. So I was given I was given a brand new phone actually to keep for a while. And she provided peer support. We were able to talk. Actually, she came by virtually every day after that, and we were able to chat about what to expect when I was discharged. All of that was really supportive and wonderful to have coming from a peer support staff.
Beautiful. Thank you, Laura.
Sure.
Karen, what would you like to add?
I would also say that when you begin to learn that sheer fear is behind so many of the delusions and hallucinations, that to pose the alternative of, would you feel more safe being in the hospital, even though it's not going to be the Hilton Hotel, versus being at home alone in your room, frightened of those aliens that are bothering you 24 hours a day, to look at balancing that choice. And sometimes safety, I think, can be very persuasive.
Excellent point. Yeah, thank you, Karen. Carolyn, in your talk, you mentioned anosognosia, you named it, which is a neurological condition in which insight into an illness is grossly impaired. It can co-occur with schizophrenia for around 50 to 60% of individuals with schizophrenia. And of course, lacking insight or, not having an awareness of an illness would prevent somebody from seeking or even accepting help. And so I'm wondering how, if at all, has your perspective on involuntary treatment changed over time as your awareness of illness or your interest in treatment has changed?
I think so. And I've been involuntarily hospitalized twice. And in that time, it's kind of like Karen was saying, like, would you feel safe here? Because on my own, outside of the hospitalization, I didn't feel safe. And maybe for the first couple of days of the hospitalization, I was in a new environment, and they were feeding me, and I did feel a bit safer until, of course, the delusions it doesn't matter where I am. I always feel unsafe, but there's like an illusion of safety when I'm first hospitalized. So I think I was more, what would the word be? Like I was more game to be there. When I've been voluntarily hospitalized, it was kind of like, okay, well, I have to go through with this. This is the only option. I'm putting this off until it's absolutely necessary. Like, I don't want to be here. I'm grumpy. I'm angry. I don't want to eat my food. I don't want to leave my room. And I think it's interesting. There's like these two differences of like, when it's involuntary, I kind of go along with it. And when it's voluntary, I'm so used to like, I remember being treated like less than human. Like I remember, and I have this stigma that I've created, and I'm thinking, well, I don't want to go through with that again unless I absolutely have to. And now it kind of comes down to, really, I only see myself going back to the hospital if I need like a medication overhaul, because it seems like that's kind of the only benefit each time. When I've gone voluntarily, I kind of leave feeling like, well, that was a week of my life. Like I didn't feel like anything came out of it any of the times other than just medication. So I just kind of have found other ways of getting through those crises now, and being much closer with my doctor than I was before. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Karen, I'm going to ask you to respond to that question as well, because you had also talked about illness awareness in your family story, your son's story. And you're muted.
So in my relative's case, that awareness has had peaks where he has had intense awareness, which actually brings more depression about his life, understanding what the illness is, and then it wanes and it's not there anymore, which has unfortunately brought it to this point that we talked about of being involuntarily hospitalized when danger becomes an issue.
I add something to this question.
Yes.
I guess the irony, I have trouble pronouncing the word agnosia. Yeah, I do, but yeah. I just want to say that there's something amiss here. My story included going to a general hospital emergency room 15 times. I mean, I was aware of something. I know my drive was to get sleep, which, by the way, when I was finally admitted, then there was an involuntary admittance with forced treatment. I was brought to a ward and I was there for 30 days. And actually all I needed, I felt, was sleep. Now, they did provide me with medication. And when I was discharged, I went directly to a community mental health center. I was also discharged back to a women's shelter, by the way, but I was taking medication that I understood what it was for. It was a low dose. But the fact here is that I guess I want to point out that here I was aware that something was amiss. I went to an emergency room 15 times and I was turned away. And there's something wrong, with that picture, I guess, when we're talking about this, what seems to be a phenomenon of lacking insight. I think we need to really take a look at what that means.
I think that's an excellent point, Laura. I think, there's so many contributing factors here, and there's levels to these factors. We have social, we have system, which is, I think, what you're really highlighting here. We have family, we have person. And, it's really, there's so much to unpack in terms of what are the opportunities to start to improve the quality of care, access to care, and right-fitting care for each individual. And I think each of you highlighted so many opportunities to make these system-level enhancements. And I want to dig in a little bit to those in the remaining time that we have. We had in one of our previous webinars a question that came in from a family member asking about what reflections or recommendations could be shared with family members who are worried about their loved ones. And so, Karen, I want to turn that to you to see if you, first and foremost, have any guidance.
Well, the psychological word would be normalizing an experience in which we feel very isolated when we have concerns about a loved one with mental illness. But whether it's a NAMI support group, whether it would be taking a class from something like Family to Family, or the Psychosis Reach, P-Reach classes, and the opportunity for small group meetings with the family ambassador or one-on-one meetings with a family ambassador, all gives you a very exclusive club of new friends forever that you will probably be calling on many times. And again, normalizes the situation.
And I would like to add that, just in terms of my family, I think and by the way, my very first hospitalization was in 1978, and that was before the National Alliance on Mental Illness ever came to pass. So we have to remember that we've had cycles of change within our field, and fortunately there has been a NAMI established, and even other family organizations, even on the mental health side throughout these years. But I think what supported my mother this go around, that I had the more acute care interface, was that I had a therapist working with me, and she was able to communicate with support for her as well. Some of that didn't happen until after the hospitalization ended, but there's now more ongoing communication, and I just think that it's important that families have alternative ways of getting support as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. I just want to acknowledge that the amount of time and emotional energy that each of you have invested, you each provided powerful testimony today. And on behalf of the CMHPL, I want to thank you for your contributions to this series, which were significant. It is still the case that mental illness is a dirty word in our society, which makes these acts of vulnerability courageous and inspiring. So thank you. And I also want to acknowledge that, as with previous webinars in this series, we had far more thought-provoking questions than we had time to address. So for that reason, we hope that you'll join us when we meet on June 10th to bring back all of our panelists for a Q&A. We hope that you join us for the next webinar in this series, in which I'll be talking about some of the work that the Washington State Healthcare Authority has funded to improve the access to evidence-based psychotherapy across levels of care, including individuals who are on an involuntary treatment act. So we're going to put a survey into the chat right now. We appreciate your feedback. It definitely helps us to improve, develop future events. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute or two to respond, I appreciate that. It should be coming up as a pop-up on your screen. And once you're done with the survey, you can pop off. Your CME instructions have just been entered into the chat as well, so you can revisit those if you need a refresher. There are some hyperlinks in the chat for you to follow, and we hope that we see you again on March 4th. Thank you all, and thank you, Laura. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Carolyn.